Welcome to the second part of this video in which we will be discussing on the security of ICS. In the first part of this video, we discussed on industrial control system. We built our understanding on what industrial control system is. And now that we have the base, we have the understanding of industrial control system, we will go on discussing about the security and what are the components involved in securing the industrial control system. So, as a IT security professional who is working within the manufacturing environment or industrial environment, it becomes very important to have a general understanding on what industrial control system is. We will revise it once again in this video very quickly. Industrial control system, they exist on the factory floors to control conveyor belts and industrial robots. So the factory floors, they have these physical processes that are running in order to produce something, to produce a product or a service. So, in order to control these physical processes and the devices that are involved in these physical processes, like conveyor belts, assembly lines, forklifts, cranes, industrial robots, in order to control these different components and these physical processes, you would have an industrial control system in place. Now, since this industrial control system is controlling the processes that can directly cause harm to human life, safety is utmost important here in operating the industrial control system. Because unlike the IT organization, in the IT organization, you are just dealing with information and virtual processes. In an IT organization, if you end up implementing a wrong security control, at the most you will cause downtime, but there will be no loss of human life. You will end up maybe shutting down the company, you will end up incurring certain loss for the company, financial loss for the company, but you will not end up hurting somebody physically. You will not cause a loss of human life. But in an ICS environment, if security is implemented without safety, without taking safety into consideration, you might end up swinging a robotic arm which is on the factory floor and which might hurt several factory workers who are working on the shop floor. So that is the reason safety is very important when it comes to ICS system. Another important consideration is the availability, the uptime. So let's take an example of a power generation company. The power generation company is producing the power and supplying it to cities. Cities have different hospitals. These hospitals are serving to humans in healthcare. If the power generation company faces an outage, the cities face an outage, these hospitals face an outage, and then the hospitals won't be able to serve, and there will be loss of human life again. Similarly, there is, let's take an example of a water generation company, a water generation facility. If it faces an outage, there is no water to cities and there's loss of human life again. So that is the reason uptime and availability is also very critical. So the ICS system, it operates on these two principles. It operates on safety and it operates on availability. These are the two most, these are the two principles on which the ICS system operates, and the security will come later. Now, what are the risks? What is the vulnerability that the ICS is facing today? With the increasing connectivity to the IT networks, the single greatest vulnerability an ICS is facing today is connectivity to the IT networks. This has two side effects. One is that the ICS has started to use now more and more standard protocols of IT. And second is it is exposing the ICS systems to anyone who has a connection to the network. So, why this is happening is because we are in the transition of Industry 4.0, which means digitization of these physical processes. So, there are a lot of manual processes that are run by humans currently on the shop floor and which have a scope of getting digitized and automized. And the process optimization team, which sit on the shop floor, which are part of IT, they are looking to automate these processes, digitize these processes. There are a lot of digitization teams that are working with manufacturing companies in order to digitize the physical processes. To give you an example, uh, which I've seen, is there are these quality check teams who manually check the product and then manually fill out a sheet which is for quality inspection. Now, if a process optimization team is paying close attention to this process, what they can do is they can automate this process, they can digitize this process, they can give a workstation or maybe a tablet computer to the quality inspection person. He can simply fill out the information for the quality inspection in a software. That software will further talk to maybe the SCADA system or maybe the inventory system and feed that information automatically within the system. So all this manual process gets automated. There are a lot of other processes also that are running on the shop floor which can be automated. There are these data acquisition needs now with data analytics and data science in boom. A lot of industries are looking forward to making use of their data in order to increase profits, save costs, optimize production. One example is that you can collect a lot of data on energy consumption, on electricity consumption from the plants, run analytics software on it, and then through analytics you can understand which plants are consuming more electricity, which particular processes are consuming more electricity. Is there a scope to optimize that? Is there a scope to reduce electricity consumption there? If yes, then that can decrease costs, that can increase savings, increase profits, optimize productions. So all these kind of different projects that are running currently on in the ICS environment, they demand the ICS environment to be connected with the IT networks. And now when you are connecting the ICS devices with the IT networks, the vendors are also manufacturing these devices, taking these requirements into consideration. So 10 years ago, 20 years ago, you would not have a scene within an ICS environment where a PLC was connected to the network and it had IP address. But now, this scenario is very common where you would have a PLC connected to the network. It will have an IP address. It will be operating on standard IT protocols. Um, so imagine now what happens when ICS devices start to listen and mm, run and communicate on these standard IT protocols. If I'm an attacker, I have designed an attack for a IT organization, then now with the convergence of the standard protocols within the ICS, and now that I know that ICS industries are also using the standard IT protocols, I can use the same attack on manufacturing industries as well, on industrial environment as well, and then cause a bigger impact. So this is the risk. This is the big vulnerability that the ICS networks are facing today. Another big risk that we see within the ICS environment is that the ICS devices, they have a very long shelf lives, due to which we run into a scene where we see a lot of devices within an ICS environment that are very old, that are not patched, and the support for them is already expired from the vendor side. So when a factory is set up, when an ICS environment is set up, when physical devices are set up there, these are set up with a long term vision in mind, with a long term projection in mind. Unlike IT, in an IT environment, you would have a server running at the most for 3 or 4 years. After that, the software will be upgraded, the hardware will be upgraded, and you would not run into these scenarios where you will have very legacy old 2003 servers in an IT environment. But in an ICS environment, you would have PLCs that are 10, 20 years old and still working. And in an IT environment, you get this flexibility of downtime and testing the patches. Building a test environment for testing patches in an IT environment is not very costly. You can take few systems, build a test lab, test the patches there, and then regularly deploy it to the production systems. Plus, you have this flexibility of taking regular downtimes. But in an industrial environment, you do not have this flexibility of taking the downtime. As I was discussing the power generation company example on the previous slide, if you're a power generation company, maintaining uptime and availability is very important there, because you are supplying power to big cities, which in turn is supplying power to a lot of other critical facilities like healthcare. So there, taking a downtime is not possible. It is not that frequent. Plus, building a test facility, a separate laboratory for testing the patches for is a costly affair when it comes to ICS. Another seen that I've seen is that in an ICS environment, if you upgrade a PLC with the latest patch or a device with the latest patch, the change is irreversible. You will have to manually take the backup on a pen drive of the PLC's code and then upgrade the PLC. And if you want to reverse the change, you will have to again go through a manual process of reversing the change, which is very cumbersome. But in an IT, the change is very easily reversible. If there is an update which is causing some downtime, which is causing some issues, you can easily reverse the update. You have the flexibility of taking VM snapshots, reversing the change within minutes with few clicks. But in an industrial environment, you do not have this flexibility of reversing the change very easily. That is also one of the reason why you will find a lot of unpatched devices, and this is a big risk. Unpatched devices is a big risk for the ICS environment. So, what are the security recommendations which are there for the ICS environment? The standards give a lot of security recommendations. There are different standards which are available for industrial environments by different companies, by different bodies in different countries. Uh, but one of the we will not be discussing all those standards, but we will be discussing rather one top security recommendation which is there in every standard to address the vulnerability and mitigate the risk of unpatched devices, which is the network segmentation via a next generation firewall. So, what is a next generation firewall? A next generation firewall is something that will have application control in place, that will have intrusion prevention system, which will have user identity awareness, SSL inspection, URL filtering, centralized management. All these different modules will be running on the device of the next generation firewall. It will have these features in place using which it will inspect the traffic, using which we can apply granular policies, we can apply granular control to the traffic that flows between the IT and the OT. These next generation firewalls can be centrally managed, which means if you're implementing a firewall in every plant, then if you have hundreds of plant, the firewalls there can be centrally managed through a single centralized software. That is the next generation firewall. So implementing a network segmentation between the IT and the OT network is very important, uh, because then whatever threats that are originating in the IT network cannot be passed on to the OT network, and similarly whatever threats that are originating in the IT network cannot get passed on to the IT network. Suppose if you are an attacker, if you get foothold, if you get um, established within the IT network, if you don't have a firewall in between, then traveling to OT network is very easy. And the devices on the OT network, as I said, can be very legacy devices. It can be a 10-year-old, 20-year-old PLC, which will not ask for authentication before you're using it. There can be HMI workstations which will not ask for any authentication before issuing any commands. So that is the reason if attacker gets entry into the OT network, it is very easy for the attacker to create a bigger impact there and to cause loss of human life. So that is the reason having a next generation firewall between the IT and the OT network is very important, so that any traffic that travels from the IT network to the OT network and from the OT network to IT network gets inspected, and only if there is a rule in place, then that traffic will be allowed. One example of how you can benefit from the next generation firewall in the unpatched device scenario, what I can think of is the latest uh, Rockwell vulnerability that came out for the Rockwell PLCs. I already have a video for it on my channel, um, for the Rockwell vulnerabilities that came out in the Rock Allen Bradley PLCs, I think. And now, if you have a PLC on the OT network and there is a vulnerability that is announced by the vendor, that and there is an exploit available to exploit that PLC, then what do you do? Um, I mean, you cannot simply try and apply. You cannot simply go ahead and upgrade the patch. As I said, that availability and downtime is very important. Then, in those cases, how next generation firewall can help here is that it can sort of apply a virtual patch. I mean, the next generation firewall will have a signature available, an intrusion prevention signature available from the vendor, which if you deploy in the form of a rule, then Any traffic that matches that signature for matches that attack signature will be blocked, will be dropped, and will not enter into the OT network. So if you have a PLC that is vulnerable to the attack, then you simply need to enable the IPS signature for it, and then the IPS signature will take care. It will simply act as a virtual patch, and it will protect your PLC from the attacker's traffic and attacker's exploit. So this is one example how a next generation firewall can help. It can provide virtual patching for the unpatched devices. So usually that is a common scenario whenever there is a vulnerability released in any of the OT device, in any of the PLCs. The vendors, they will release the patch, and then the firewall vendors, they will also release um, a IPS signature for that attack. They will study the attack patterns, and accordingly they will develop a IPS signature, and they will um, send it out via an update to the firewall. And you simply have to enable that IPS signature, and then that IPS signature can sort of act as a virtual patch. It will drop the traffic for the attacker's attack. So that's it then in this video. I hope this was helpful in helping you to understand the topmost security recommendation, uh, that is segmenting the IT and the OT network, how it can help um, in strengthening the security of the ICS environment. Because uh, on the ICS environment, you have very limited options. You cannot uh, install endpoint security controls such as anti-malware, antivirus softwares. You cannot implement strong authentication mechanisms in HMIs, PLCs, and in these devices, because they are running firmwares which are hardened um, devices, and they cannot be installed with these endpoint security controls. In an IT environment, it's having these endpoint security controls on the IT devices is very common. And plus the legacy OT devices, these PLCs, they um, do not have a built-in intrinsic security features like authentication and everything in place. That is the reason having a segmentation between the IT and the OT network is very important. One another scenario I would like to discuss before I close is that uh, the OT network is very sensitive to um, IT traffic, which means what I mean is that if you have vulnerability assessment, if you have penetration tests going on in the IT network, then there are a lot of broadcast traffic that goes on in the IT network, the ARP protocol traffic um, that is part of the broadcast traffic in the IT network, and the OT devices are not um, very adjustable to this broadcast type of traffic, to this huge size of the size of traffic, and that is the reason they can fail, they can start to malfunction. um, I have read about certain examples within the ICS security guides where a certain vulnerability assessment caused a lot of traffic to be sent to the OT network devices, and then the OT network devices started to malfunction. The industrial robots, they started to malfunction, and there was a lot of damage. Similarly, even if you're not running vulnerability assessment tests or penetration tests, there is a lot of broadcast traffic that is going on within the IT network. The computers are very chatty. They send a lot of traffic to each other within the network. And if there is a machine in the same network, if your OT network and IT network is really a flat network, there is no firewall in between, then this broadcast traffic will hit the OT devices as well. And then the OT devices, as I said, are not designed to handle this huge amount of traffic, and they will start to malfunction, and you might have a bigger impact there. So that is the reason having a segmentation and treating these two networks separately is very important, and this is one of the topmost security recommendation. In my another video where I have discussed about the Rockwell PLC logic vulnerability, I have discussed more on the segmentation firewall. You can go ahead and check that out. All right, then, thank you so much for your time. I'll see you in the next video.